In this review, we're going to look at evolution and classification. So remember, evolution starts with mutations that provide the raw materials. And these are random, and you have to have mutations because mutations result in genetic variation, which are differences in the individuals. You have to have that variation. Another way that you can help improve variation, remember, is sexual reproduction. Now, this genetic variation is going to be acted on by natural selection, which means that some organisms are more adapted than others to selective pressures like predation. And so nature is essentially going to select those individuals that are most adapted, and that means some are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. And so the best adapted will most likely pass their genes on. And this is going to result in a change in the allele frequency. So this mutant gene or mutant allele has increased in frequency within the population, and that means that the population has actually evolved. And if this happens over and over and over again, you can get large changes in organisms. Remember, we have as evidence for evolution the fossil record that tells us the timeline and what used to exist. We have anatomical evidence, which are similar structures like bones and things, as well as vestigial organs like the human appendix. And then we have biochemical, which really is the best evidence. And again, biochemical, living chemicals, or chemicals for life, things like DNA, proteins, and enzymes. So the more similar your DNA, proteins, or enzymes are, the more similar and more related you are. All right, remember, selective pressures are things that make it harder for an organism to survive. And because they make it harder for them to survive, the ability to overcome those pressures is called an adaptation, and those that are most adapted to those pressures will be most likely to survive, reproduce, and pass along those genes. Selective pressures can be caused by abiotic factors, which are the non-living parts of the ecosystem, like temperature and water, or biotic factors, which are the living parts, things like symbiotic relationships, predation, disease, those kind of things. Geographic isolation is something that can result in speciation, which is where one species becomes two. And remember, a species is a genetically distinct population that either can't or won't interbreed with others. And geographic isolation works by a population gets separated by something like a mountain or a river or some sort of geographic feature. Different mutations will occur in the two different populations. And eventually they will build up over time. And once they build up enough, those populations actually become genetically different. And when they become genetically different enough, they will become two actual distinct species. Now let's look at classification. So remember, we change our classification system when we learn or when new organisms are found, when we learn new things, kind of like what DNA is and how it works, and we develop new technologies, things like the ability to compare DNA. That's been a really big thing that's helped us change our classification system to be better. Our current classification system is based on common ancestry, and another way to look at this is evolutionary relatedness. So where did these species come from? Where do they share common ancestors? And it's broken into 8 taxonomic groups, which look like this. So remember, these are our groups, and as you go up the chain, you get more species, but they are less related. So for example, one of the kingdoms is the animal kingdom. That's all animals. Lots of species, not very related. As you go down, you get fewer species, and they are more related. We can use this to figure out which organisms are most and least related, So for example, the coyote is the least related because, as you can see, it's in a different family. And then the lynx and the bobcat are the most related because they share the most groups in common. We can also use a DNA fingerprint. Again, the coyote has the least number of bands in common with anybody, whereas the lynx and the bobcat are very, very similar, so they are the most related. A phylogenetic tree shows all of these, this common ancestry and speciation. So remember, every one of these branches is where species have diverged. In other words, two groups of species broke. And so that also represents the last common ancestor of the species past that divergence. The most related then are the ones that have diverged the most recently. So they would be the closest together. The ones that are the farthest apart, which would kind of be those two on the outside, they share a common ancestor the most distantly. And then remember, we use dichotomous keys in order to identify organisms. So for example, if we were looking at number 1, we know that's a dog. We start with 1 and say, does it have 2 or 4 legs or not? It does, so we go to number 2. It's either got wings or doesn't have wings. It doesn't have wings, and so it's Canis familiaris, which is the scientific name of the dog.